I mean, what I'm hearing right now is that people are really frustrated that the president wasn't out there this week. He did that rally last week in North Carolina on Friday, and then kind of went dark. He had a couple of little, he could have come out, and he did come out to talk about immunity. But a lot of my sources have been saying that was a perfect opportunity to get in front of a camera to say, what is going on here? Let me talk more about democracy. Let me take your questions on what happened, to try to reverse course and change the narrative. But they've missed a lot of opportunities this week. And that is what has been frustrating a lot of people, donors, operatives, people that really love this man. They're all concerned about that. So it might be a little bit too little too late at that point.
Yeah. And Max, I mean, you, of course, served in the House. I wonder what conversations you're having with your former colleagues and how this is sort of being talked about among Democrats and among lawmakers in general.
No, you're going to see, if there's going to be any action, you're going to see that action come out of the House. And particularly, I think that we should keep our eyes on the frontliners, right? Those Democrats in very competitive seats who have one responsibility and one responsibility only, and that is to hold on to their seat. But here's what I think is the overarching point. I have not spoken to one Democrat or heard anyone else speak to another Democrat in a position of power who is happy about this situation. Not one. They all want Joe Biden to be the nominee, and they are all extraordinarily proud of this president's record for the past 4 years, which makes it even more imperative that the president does everything that he can over the coming days to show that he is in a firm position to go forward.
Yeah. Well, as Brendan, I want to come to you because there's this idea that as Democrats, even privately, are telling some of us that they want the president to continue. Donald Trump has kept a low profile. There's some reporting that he wants President Biden to stay in as well. I wonder what you're thinking about the strategy of President or former President Trump here when it comes to sort of being quieter than usual.
Yeah. Credit to him for showing incredible discipline. Even during the debate, he could have thrown a few more elbows than he did. And the rally the next day, they are smartly just letting Joe Biden twist in the wind here because they're doing really nothing to help themselves. And so while your opponent is struggling like this, the last thing that Donald Trump wants to do is bring attention back to himself. So we'll see how long that lasts. But it is a remarkably good strategy. But you raise a good point. The Trump campaign and Donald Trump actually don't want Joe Biden to drop out. There has been a theory, I will say, on the right for a very long time that Joe Biden was eventually going to drop out, that they were going to replace him. And this doesn't surprise a lot of Republicans. You watch Fox News and they talk about this quite a bit long before this debate. They think Joe Biden is the easiest person to defeat, and any effort to remove him is going to be called some kind of election interference. And you're already sort of seeing some of that spin. They want Joe Biden to stay there because they know that he is clearly incapable of fixing some of these fundamental problems that voters see with him.
Yeah. And as these questions are continuing to swirl, Amy, there is one big concern, and it's for really the Biden campaign donors. We've seen at least one big donor, a Netflix founder, Reed Hastings, call for Biden to drop out of this race. How hard is the Biden campaign, the Biden world working to keep donors on board here as all these questions continue to swirl?
They're trying pretty hard. They had a call this week with donors, 500 or so were on the call. But I talked to a lot of them after the call, and they were not happy. They were frustrated. A lot of them have been pouring their heart and souls into this campaign, and they can't believe where it is right now. And I'm speaking to a lot of them. I've spoken to some this morning who say he's not helping himself. He hasn't done anything to help himself up to this point. And they're leaving a lot to chance by just saying, okay, we're doing the Stephanopoulos interview on Friday. We're going to do campaign events next week and hold a press conference next week because this is unraveling minute by minute. And the longer this goes, the longer the president is sort of out of the spotlight, the more nervous a lot of these donors are getting. So I think that many more of them might come out in the coming days if the president doesn't quickly change course.
Yeah. And Max, I want to go back to you because you said, there are a lot of Democrats who want to see the president stay in. But I have to ask you, if the president were to leave, right now, of course, he is not doing that. Is there enough time, you think, to coalesce around a new candidate? And would that new candidate have to be the VP, or would there be scenarios that maybe others could come in? And what would that look like?
I think that's two separate points. One, there's absolutely enough time to coalesce around another candidate because the Democratic Party is so much more than one person, considering the fact that of what we are up against. Let's not forget that Donald Trump yet again showed himself to be a absolutely crazy person with no regard for our Constitution and no capacity to actually answer substantive questions about his plans to address the economy, our national security, and to improve people's way of life. But certainly, if something were to happen, I think the natural choice is the vice president. I think it would be a foolhardy mistake to skip over her, and I think it would offend quite a number of people, damage our coalition, and not do service to her record.
Yeah. And Brennan, Max here is saying that there is time to coalesce people. I wonder, one, what you think of that, and also, is there really time to maybe win over those independents with all of this chaos going on when you think of people like the Nikki Haley voters?
Yeah, I agree that Kamala Harris is the obvious choice, and it would be silly to try to disrupt and have the chaos of an open primary in this short, truncated period of time. Look, I think there are some obvious risks to Kamala Harris. She's going to be seen as more progressive than Joe Biden is, and they'll have to work to push back against that a little bit. But she could, on the plus side, energize the Democratic coalition in a way that you have seen a lot of a lack of enthusiasm from a lot of really core constituencies in the Democratic Party, and whether or not she could, energize the black vote, the youth vote that has been struggling, could actually be, I think, encouraging for them. She's still going to be an underdog, though. Either way, this is a bad situation they have no good options, and I understand why Biden resisted stepping away in the first place.
Yeah, certainly a lot of anxiety that I'm hearing, and Ali, you're probably hearing that too. I want to ask you, there's new reporting, though, that President Biden was seeing a doctor after the debate. What more can you tell us about that?
Yeah, Yamiche, there was a lot of confusion over the last couple days after we know that the president privately told donors that he did see a doctor after we know that he had a cold on the debate stage last week. And then yesterday we heard Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre say that despite the president having a cold, that he has not seen a doctor since that debate performance. And of course, we know that his doctor travels alongside him for so many of these trips. So it caused a lot of confusion. The White House today is clarifying that, saying that the president hasn't had a physical since his last in February, but he has seen doctors regularly for brief check-ins. And they say that several days after the debate, the president did check in with a doctor about that mentioned cold from the press secretary, Yamiche.
Yeah. Interesting information given all of the questions that the White House is fielding now. So thank you so much to Ali, to Amy, to Max, and to Brendan Buck for all of your reporting and your analysis.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.